What would you do if in the middle of a crowded auction yard, a starving gray stallion suddenly locked eyes with you as if it had been waiting its whole life for that exact moment? That's what happened to a quiet rancher named Caleb Rowe the morning he walked into Redwater Auction and walked out with every doomed horse on the lot. But no one, not the bidders, not the owner, not even Caleb himself, could have predicted what happened next. Especially when that same stallion did something no horse was ever supposed to understand. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Stay with me, because the truth behind what happened that day will take you into a story you'll never forget. The sun had barely risen when the first vibration rattled the phone in Caleb Rowe's pocket. He was halfway along the western fence line of his ranch, checking for breaks after last night's windstorm, when the buzz came again, short, sharp, insistent. Caleb pulled the phone out more annoyed than curious, expecting a weather alert or a neighbor asking if his cattle had wandered again. But the screen showed only a single message. No name, no number, just text. Redwater Auction, noon. Horses being shipped to kill buyers. If you care, go. Caleb froze. For a long moment, he simply stood there in the crisp morning air, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. Anonymous messages were never good news in this part of the country. And Redwater Auction. That name alone carried enough rumors to curdle a man's stomach. He exhaled slowly and looked up across the field. Brimstone, his old chestnut gelding, stood by the fence ears forward as though he'd been watching Caleb the entire time. There were moments, usually quiet ones like this, when Caleb wondered if Brimstone understood more than any animal should. "Well, boy," Caleb muttered, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Looks like someone wants trouble delivered before breakfast." The horse snorted, almost as if in answer. Caleb started walking again, but his mind was no longer on the fence. The message had stirred up whispers he'd been trying to ignore for months. Talk of Redwater selling horses, not to ranchers or families, but to slaughter buyers shipping truckloads to unregulated facilities across the Mexican border. Horses no one wanted. Horses no one would miss, except Caleb did miss them. All of them. Jonah Pike had taught him that every horse mattered, even the old, the skittish, the broken. Jonah, who died a year ago in what everyone called a training accident. Jonah, whose stallion ghost had vanished the same night. Caleb wiped the sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. Something about today felt wrong, heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Decision made, he strode back to the barn. He filled water drums, tossed hay bales into the trailer, and grabbed the rusted toolbox he always kept under the tack room bench. As he lifted the trailer ramp, Brimstone walked forward on his own, slow, steady, certain stepping inside, without being asked. "You feel it too, huh?" Caleb said softly, fastening the latch. In less than 15 minutes, he'd locked the ranch gate behind him and was rumbling down the dirt road toward Redwater. Dawn was only just beginning to paint the horizon gold. The closer he got to the auction yard, the thicker the air seemed to become heavy with the sour blend of manure, sweat, rust, and something sharper metallic. The sound of hooves striking metal panels echoed faintly through the cold morning, each clang carrying a note of fear that tightened Caleb's chest. By the time he parked his truck near the back lot, the restless stamping from inside the auction barn felt like a plea. Caleb stepped inside and stopped. More than 27 horses were packed into narrow pens, their ribs showing through mud-stiffened coats. Some stood with heads, low eyes dull. Others paced in frantic circles, hooves slipping on the filthy floors. Caked manure lined the railings. The only feed in sight were matted clumps of moldy hay. The water troughs were dry. A bay mare flinched when he approached, revealing a deep cut along her shoulder. Another horse turned its head, and Caleb saw rope burns carved into its cheeks, where a halter had been yanked too tight, too long. He clenched his jaw, forcing down the anger rising in him like wildfire. One of the yard workers leaned against a gate, watching Caleb with a smirk, as if he were some sentimental fool wandering into the wrong kind of business. Caleb ignored him and moved pen to pen counting injuries, memorizing faces. A young sorrel colt stretched its neck through the rail's lips, trembling as it tried to nuzzle Caleb's jacket. He stroked its muzzle gently. "Easy little guy," he murmured. "You don't deserve this." He wasn't sure any of them did. He had nearly circled the last set of pens when he felt a presence behind him, heavy and still. Caleb turned, and his breath caught in his throat. In the darkest corner of the barn stood a massive gray stallion, tall as a myth coat, shimmering pale silver beneath layers of grime. Its mane hung long and tangled, but its eyes burned bright, intelligent, alive. And familiar. "No," Caleb whispered. The stallion stepped forward, slow and deliberate, pushing past two terrified geldings, trying to avoid it. When it reached the rail, it lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it drew in Caleb's scent. Then it touched its nose to his chest. A shock ran through Caleb like lightning. He staggered a step backward. Ghost. His voice broke on the name. Ghost Jonah Pike's horse. The horse no one had seen since the night Jonah died. The horse people claimed had gone wild and uncatchable after the accident. But here he was, thin injured, but unmistakably alive. Ghost let out a soft rumble, remembering him. Caleb pressed a trembling hand to the stallion's cheeks, trying to breathe. Behind him, a pair of buyers muttered, "That's the one they couldn't handle. Mean as a cougar. Nearly killed a wrangler last month." But Ghost didn't look mean. Not now. He stood pressed against Caleb like he'd been waiting for him. And in that moment, Caleb knew Ghost wasn't at Redwater by chance. Something had brought him here. Or someone. A harsh laugh snapped Caleb back to reality. Grant Huxley, the auction yard's owner, strutted toward him with the satisfied swagger of a man who believed he owned everything he touched. "Well, look who wandered in," Huxley drawled. "You interested in buying something, Rowe? Or just browsing the charity cases?" Caleb kept his hand on Ghost's neck. "How long has this horse been here?" Huxley shrugged. "Long enough. Hardly worth the trouble if you ask me. But kill buyers will take anything. They don't get picky." Caleb's stomach twisted. He scanned the barn again and saw them clearly this time. Sheets of red paper attached to each pen gate. Scheduled for slaughter. 3:15 p.m. Destination El Paso Holding Facility. The signatures at the bottom were forged to look official, but Caleb had seen real documents before. These were sloppy, rushed, dangerous. These horses weren't being sold. They were being erased. Meanwhile, buyers were checking hooves, prying mouths open to look at teeth-slapping hindquarters as if appraising furniture instead of living creatures. One man yanked a mare's head so hard she squealed, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Caleb closed his eyes, breathing through the fury. This wasn't a business. It was butchery. The auctioneer's bell rang. People surged toward the central ring, raising bidding paddles, laughing, joking about which horses would render the best meat. Something inside Caleb snapped. He stepped forward, first one stride, then another, until he stood dead center in the ring. Buyers murmured in annoyance. Huxley squinted at him. "Rowe, what the hell are you doing? Move aside." But Caleb didn't move. He looked at the terrified horses in the holding chute, at Ghost staring at him with fierce, unwavering eyes. His voice rose steady and unmistakable. "I will take all these horses." Silence fell for a single breath and then erupted into laughter. All of them. Is he drunk? He ain't got that kind of money. Get him out of the ring. Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled the battered checkbook from his jacket, flipped it open, and held it up. I said all of them, he repeated. Now make the paperwork. Huxley's grin faltered. Even if you could pay, which you can't, why would I sell to you? Because Caleb said, stepping closer, your own rules say the buyer with full payment wins. And I'm paying now. He wrote the number without hesitation, a sum large enough to make his hands shake. But he didn't stop, didn't look away. When he tore the check from the book and set it on the auction block, the room went quiet. Utterly quiet. Huxley swallowed, glanced around at the witnesses, then spat. Fine. They're yours. Don't say I didn't warn you when half of them dropped dead on your property. Someone in the crowd lifted a phone and began recording. The paperwork finished, Caleb walked back to the pens with a knot in his throat. Now came the hard part, getting the horses out. When he opened the first gate, the animals scrambled backward, crowding the far corner, trembling eyes wide with terror. They're scared out of their minds, Caleb whispered. It's okay. You're safe now. But words meant nothing to horses that had only known pain. Then Ghost stepped forward. One slow, confident stride, then another. He passed by Caleb without fear, shoulders squared, head lifted. At the threshold of the open pen, he paused and looked back at the others. His breath rolled out in a deep, calming gust. The sorrel colt stepped forward, first drawn to him. Then a bay mare. Then two more. Within seconds, the entire pen was moving, following Ghost, as though he were a commander calling troops home. A shout echoed from the far side of the barn. Holy hell, look at that, he's leading them. Phones came up. Cameras flashed. Voices rose in disbelief as Ghost guided the frightened herd through the aisles, gentle, deliberate, assured. Like he'd done it 100 times before. By the time they reached the loading ramp, the video was already spreading across social media. Loading 27 half-starved horses into a pair of old stock trailers was no easy task. Caleb hauled buckets of clean water, arranged hay nets, and separated animals based on weight and temperament. The work was exhausting, but adrenaline carried him. Brimstone, tied near the ramp, stood rigid and alert, as if guarding the entire process. Whenever a skittish mare hesitated, Brimstone would lower his head and breathe softly until she calmed enough to climb aboard. Ghost, too, stayed near Caleb. Every few minutes, he tapped a hoof lightly against the metal siding, not hard enough to dent it, just enough to make a sound. A check-in. A question. You're doing good, Caleb murmured, patting his neck. Real good. When the last gate latch shut, he looked around the now empty pens. The silence hollowed him. Where terror had filled the air, moments ago, only stillness remained. He climbed into his truck, released the breath he'd been holding, and started the engine. The 3-hour drive home was slow. He took every turn carefully to avoid startling the horses. Dust rose behind the tires, catching the late sunlight. Ghost's occasional taps echoed through the trailer whenever the road jostled a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, reminding Caleb he was not alone. At the ranch, Caleb opened the main gate and guided the trailers into the wide pasture. When he lowered the ramps, the horses stepped out cautiously, sniffing the soil, the air, the open space. Freedom felt foreign but inviting. Brimstone trotted over, greeting each newcomer with a dignified nod. Ghost followed, touching noses with the youngest foals circling the herd like a sentinel. Caleb stood there, hands on his hips, watching them breathe, watching them live. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture. "Welcome home," he whispered, and somewhere inside him an old door creaked open, letting in the light. Why did Caleb buy every single horse that day? And why did the entire herd follow Ghost as if he were their true leader? Share your thoughts with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe before we step into the most shocking part of the story. The sun had barely pushed over the horizon when Dr. May Fletcher's dusty Subaru turned onto Caleb Rowe's long ranch road. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the tension in her posture, her back rigid, her eyes scanning the pasture as though preparing herself for the worst. May was not a woman easily rattled. She'd spent more than a decade tending to rodeo horses, rescue animals, and the occasional half-wild Mustang someone brought in with a broken leg. But when she stepped out of the car clutching her oversized veterinary kit, her expression held something Caleb had rarely seen on her face. Fear. "Show me everything," she said, skipping the usual greeting. Caleb led her through the rows of makeshift pens where the newly rescued horses had spent their first night. Morning light spilled across the pasture, revealing just how fragile the herd was. Thin bodies, dull coats, eyes sunken with exhaustion. May moved immediately into work mode. She checked temperatures, counted respirations, pressed her stethoscope to narrow chests and heaving ribs. She tested reflexes, lifted hooves, checked the color of gums. Nearly every reading was bad. "These horses are in stage 2 malnutrition," she murmured. "Some stage 3. Caleb's jaw tightened. He followed her from pen to pen, watching silently as she documented each new injury. Deep rope burns scarred several horses' necks, clear signs of having been dragged or tightly restrained. Others had fetlocks swollen from standing too long in filthy wet bedding. Several hooves were beginning to rot. But what struck Caleb hardest were the bruises, long parallel welts running over ribs, hips, shoulders. Kill buyer marks. May straightened her notebook, trembling slightly in her grip. "This isn't random neglect, Caleb," she said. "This is patterned, systematic. Someone did this intentionally." Caleb felt heat rise behind his eyes. "I knew something was wrong at Redwater, but not like this." "You didn't save a handful of sick horses," May said, meeting his gaze. "You pulled an entire abused shipment out of a machine." When she finished the physical evaluations, May pulled a handheld scanner from her bag and approached the first horse again. "Let's check microchips," she said. "Sometimes we get lucky. Might be able to track a few owners." The scanner beeped as it passed over the mare's neck. A number appeared on the screen, but May frowned immediately. "She's not a 6-year-old mare," she muttered. "This chip says she's 12, and registered as gray. This horse is chestnut." May tried the second horse. The scanner beeped once, then glitched, flashing. "Chip overwritten," she said sharply. That's not easy to do. Not legally, anyway." The third horse scanned completely blank. "No ID at all," May said quietly. This chip was wiped clean. She stepped back, eyes narrowing. Redwater's sloppy but not sophisticated. Someone higher up is altering these records before the horses even arrive. Caleb pulled the paperwork he received from the auction out of his jacket. May held the pages up to the sunlight, letting the rays highlight faint layers of erased numbers beneath fresh ink. "Serial numbers don't match," she said. "Transport dates have been overwritten. And these destination codes, they're fake. They're not using the state's formatting at all." She lowered the papers slowly, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "They're hiding the horses' origins. All of them." They had barely finished the last scan when gravel crunched at the front gate. A beat-up blue pickup rolled into the driveway, kicking dust up behind it. The driver's side door opened, and a tall woman stepped out, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, moving with the natural balance of someone who'd spent most of her life on horseback. June Hawthorne. Caleb recognized her instantly. They'd crossed paths at rodeo events and livestock fairs, before always briefly, always in the chaos of crowds. But she had a reputation. She rescued the lost ones. The hopeless horses other people refused. Trailing behind her were 3 horses' rescues of her own thin, but better off than the ones Caleb had brought home. "Morning," June said, giving Caleb a stiff nod. Her eyes swept the ranch pens quickly, analytically. When she caught sight of Ghost, she froze. "That horse." Her voice drifted, softened. "I've heard stories about him. Rumors. No one knew where he went." Caleb followed her gaze. Ghost stood apart from the herd, alert posture, tall as if guarding the younger horses newly arrived. "He belonged to Jonah Pike," Caleb said. June inhaled sharply. I didn't know if that was true. God. Jonah deserved better. She asked if she could help with the assessments, and Caleb gladly agreed. Something in her demeanor, focused, calm, experienced, felt grounding amid the chaos unfolding around him. As May bandaged wounds and examined hooves, June dug through her weathered leather satchel and pulled out a bulky stack of papers, creased, water-stained, and covered in handwritten notes. "You need to see this," she told Caleb. "I've been tracking odd transport patterns for months. Horses disappearing from small auctions, records altered or fabricated, and every trail eventually leads back to Redwater." She laid the papers across a hay bale. Caleb scanned them quickly. "Unknown owner. No batch number. Transfer to border holding facility." He frowned, all undocumented. June tapped one page in particular, faded, almost unreadable. "This one," she said, "matches the same week Jonah Pike disappeared." The words, "Transfer batch J14, stared up at Caleb like a wound reopened. He felt the breath leave his lungs. "You think Jonah found out about this?" he whispered. June nodded slowly. "I think he found out. And they silenced him." Caleb's fingers curled tightly around the sheet, crumpling it. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the truth was beginning to take shape, cold, sharp, undeniable. As if sensing the shift in him, Ghost lifted his head from across the pasture and watched Caleb with unwavering intensity. Images flooded Caleb's mind, images he'd spent a year trying to bury. The call in the middle of the night, a frantic voice saying Jonah had fallen from his horse during a late training ride. Caleb racing to Dark Canyon, heart in his throat. Ghost standing over Jonah's body, shaking blood on his flank. Injuries that never made sense. Cuts too clean. Bruises too deliberate. Back then, he'd believed the story the sheriff told him. Needed to believe it. But now the inconsistency screamed. Ghost's long scar along his ribs. Too deep for a branch, too clean for a fall. Jonah's face that night, peaceful in some ways, but wrong in others. Not the face of a man who died on impact. The face of a man who had fought, resisted, and then lost. Caleb felt sick. "We have to keep digging," he said hoarsely. June and May exchanged grim looks. The atmosphere on the ranch shifted, as if the land itself sensed a storm forming. Later that afternoon, May insisted on examining Ghost again, this time with more precision. She guided him into the shade of an open stall, running her fingers gently along his side. The stallion flinched when she traced the long, pale scar. "I thought so," she murmured, reaching for a magnifying glass. She studied the edges of the scar, then stepped back. This wasn't caused by a fall, she said. Caleb swallowed hard. Then what caused it? May met his eyes, her voice low but firm. A bullet. A glancing one, small caliber, mid-speed. Someone shot him. Caleb's vision tunneled for a moment. "That means Jonah." May nodded solemnly. "It means Jonah didn't die in an accident. Someone attacked them." The ground beneath Caleb seemed to tilt. Ghost watched him steadily, as if waiting for him to accept what had always been true. "They tried to kill him," Caleb whispered. "And they killed Jonah instead." Silence hung heavy in the stall. That night, the ranch settled into a deceptive calm. Crickets chirped in the grass, wind rustled through the barn rafters, and the rescued horses, fed, watered, and finally safe, lay resting in the soft bedding Caleb had spread, all except Ghost. Caleb stepped outside with a cup of coffee, rubbing at his tired eyes. Across the moonlit pasture, Ghost stood alone, motionless, staring toward the distant silhouette of Dark Canyon. He didn't shift his weight, didn't lower his head. He simply watched, focused, alert, as though waiting for something only he could see. "Why the canyon?" Caleb murmured. "What are you trying to show me?" He walked toward Ghost, but the stallion didn't react. Not until Caleb reached for his reins. Then Ghost turned, looked him square in the eyes, and flicked an ear toward the canyon's black outline. Brimstone, resting near the barn, lifted his head 2 ears forward, muscles tightening with unease. A chill slid down Caleb's spine. The next day didn't ease his mind. The pattern of injuries on the other horses was too consistent. Ribs bruised at the same angle. Rope burns in identical places. Mutilations that weren't random but organized. These horses had not been gathered from random owners or abandoned lands. They had been collected, processed, readied for mass shipment. A system, a machine. And Jonah had stumbled right into its gears. Late that night, exhaustion finally pushed Caleb into the porch chair outside the barn. He meant only to rest his eyes for a minute, but sleep pulled him under fast and heavy. He woke to the sound of frantic hoofbeats. Ghost Caleb jerked upright. The stallion barreled out of his pen. He had broken the wooden latch clean off. With a wild snort, Ghost sprinted across the yard and skidded to a stop in front of Caleb. Before Caleb could react, Ghost grabbed the sleeve of his shirt with surprising gentleness and pulled. "Whoa! Hey! Easy!" Caleb tried to steady himself, but Ghost tugged harder, eyes blazing with urgency. Brimstone burst from the barn aisle, whinnying sharply, pacing back and forth like a sentinel calling out danger. "What is it?" Caleb demanded. "What's wrong?" Ghost released his sleeve, turned, and looked toward Dark Canyon again. Then he stepped forward and waited. Understanding hit Caleb like a blow to the chest. "You want me to follow you," he whispered, "to the canyon." Ghost dipped his head, once deliberate, unmistakable. Caleb stared at him, heart pounding. This wasn't random behavior. This wasn't panic. Ghost was leading him. And for the first time since Jonah's death, Caleb felt something shift inside him, something dark, giving way to a terrible, necessary clarity. He grabbed a flashlight and a rope, slung them over his shoulder, and stepped toward the waiting stallion. "Okay, Ghost," he said softly. "Show me what you've been trying to say." Ghost turned toward the canyon without hesitation. Ghost took the narrow trail with the certainty of an animal who knew exactly where he was going. Caleb recognized the path too. He'd ridden here a year ago, not long after Jonah Pike died, back when everyone still called it an accident. The same knife-thin ledges, the same outcroppings he remembered Jonah bragging about jumping over in the dark just to prove I could. Only now the place felt different. Haunted. Ghost paused at tight turns, ears pricked, as if checking landmarks against a memory only he could see. Caleb glanced down once and instantly regretted it. The drop fell away into nothingness, a narrow strip of scrub clinging to the wall before the ground disappeared into darkness. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "You lead, I'll follow." The deeper they rode, the more obvious it became. This wasn't guesswork. Ghost wasn't searching. He was retracing. He remembered. And he was bringing Caleb back to the place where everything had gone wrong. They had been riding almost an hour when Ghost slowed to a stop beside a cluster of low brush pressed against the canyon wall. It didn't look like much, just a tangle of scrub and dust where the wind had pushed debris against stone. But Ghost's reaction couldn't be mistaken. He blew hard through his nostrils, pawed at the ground, then shoved his nose into the bushes, snorting and pulling back as if the earth itself smelled wrong. "You found something, didn't you?" Caleb whispered. He slid from the saddle, looped Ghost's reins around a jut of rock, and pushed the brush aside. Beneath it, the dirt was packed harder than the surrounding ground, as if it had been disturbed and tamped down again. Caleb pulled a small folding shovel from his coat and started digging. The soil fought him, baked and stubborn, but a few inches down, metal scraped against metal with a harsh little cry. He dug faster, fingers clawing, until he uncovered the corner of a rusted tin box. His heart kicked. "Come on," he muttered, yanking it free. The lid protested, but opened with a jerk. Inside, he found a handful of tarnished .38 shell casings and a scrap of fabric stiff with old blood and dirt. The color, even faded, was unmistakable. Jonah's jacket, the one he'd worn on his last ride. Caleb's hand shook as he lifted the cloth to his face. Under the dust and rust and time, he could still smell leather and sweat and faintly Jonah's cologne. He swallowed hard and dug deeper. His shovel hit something else, softer this time. He scraped the dirt away and pulled out a plastic-wrapped bundle about the size of a paperback. The plastic was cloudy, but intact. Whoever put it here had meant for it to survive. He peeled the wrap back carefully. A black notebook lay inside the cover, scarred and bent. Caleb flipped it open. Neat block letters filled the pages, names of horse lots, routes, dates, cash amounts. There were columns labeled Purchase, Auction, Transfer, Final. Beside some entries, notes appeared: Owner resistant, paid off. Truck rerouted at night, no inspection. Sheriff's office notified equals friendly. At the bottom of several pages, the same initials repeated: S.E.V. Caleb turned to a section flagged with the end of a receipt stapled inside. There he saw it, a list of loads all marked with coded identifiers: J-09J-10J-11, J-14. Next to J-14, someone had scribbled in a rushed hand, ranch hand, asking questions. Won't be a problem after Friday. The date was the same week Jonah Pike disappeared. Beneath the notebook, shoved flat at the bottom of the hole, lay crumpled shipping manifests, nearly identical to the forms June had shown Caleb at his ranch, only these carried the original details before someone tried to erase them. Real origin locations, real lot numbers, real destinations, not meant for any legal slaughterhouse. His breath came slow and shallow. "Jonah," he whispered, "this is what you found, isn't it? This is what you died for." Behind him, Ghost shifted his weight, metal of the bit clicking softly as he chewed, eyes fixed on Caleb. Caleb picked up one of the shell casings, feeling its weight in his palm. May's voice from the barn came back to him, a small caliber glancing shot. Someone tried to shoot this horse. He looked at the casing, at the jacket scrap, at the dark canyon around them. They hadn't tried to shoot Ghost. They'd tried to kill Jonah. Ghost had just been in the way. The picture finally clicked into place. Jonah discovers the illegal pipeline. Jonah collects evidence. Jonah tries to get it out through the only place no one would expect him to be, checking his favorite canyon trail. They ambush him. They fire. The bullet grazes Ghost. Jonah goes down, and someone, shaking, bleeding, maybe dying, buries the notebook and the casings and the scrap of his own jacket, where only one creature in the world would know how to find it again. The horse at his side. Caleb closed the notebook with fingers that wouldn't stay steady. "Silas Bruckner," he said softly, staring down at the SB initials. "You son of a..." He stopped, jaw tight. There would be time for rage later. Right now, he needed to live long enough to use what Jonah had left him. "Good boy," he said, reaching up to touch Ghost's neck. You brought me right to it. Ghost exhaled heavily, as if relieved, and nudged his shoulder. Caleb rode straight from the canyon to the sheriff's office, nowhere near calm by the time he pushed through the front door. Ghost waited outside, tied to the hitching post, like any ranch horse in town. But his restless pawing carved half-moons into the dirt. Sheriff Celia Grant was behind her desk, gray hair pulled into a tight bun, reading reports. She looked up when Caleb entered, her eyes sharpening at the sight of his face. "What happened?" she asked. "You need to see this," he said. 10 minutes later, she sat with the open notebook in front of her. The casings lined up on her desk, the scrap of Jonah's jacket laid carefully aside, like fragile evidence in a courtroom. Her jaw clenched as she turned pages. Rotes, cash payouts, references to unmarked stock, and notes about friendly law enforcement. "Silas Bruckner," she said finally, tapping one of the initials. "Man's had his fingers in rodeos, trucking and horse trading for years. I've never been able to make anything stick." Caleb told her about the canyon, about Ghost, about May's conclusion on the bullet graze, about the transport forms that matched June's copies. By the time he finished, Celia's eyes were hard enough to cut stone. "This isn't just cruelty or theft," she said. "This is organized trafficking. And if Jonah had this notebook, the people involved had motive to shut him up." "You going to reopen his case?" Caleb asked quietly. Celia nodded once. "Today. We classify his death as suspicious and tie it directly to this evidence. I'll file for state assistance, maybe federal. But I'm not sweeping this under any rug, Rowe. Not on my watch." She closed the notebook carefully, like it was something sacred. "If Jonah Pike was murdered," she said, "we're going to prove it." The sun had just dropped when Caleb turned onto his ranch road again. He saw the other headlights before he saw the man. A black truck sat parked near the gate engine, idling brights, flooding the entrance. Huxley leaned against the hood, arms folded, face lit from below, in a way that flattened his features into something reptilian. Caleb's stomach tightened. "Evening, Rowe," Huxley called as Caleb pulled up. "Heard you've been playing archaeologist." Caleb stepped out, keeping his expression flat. Ghost snorted warily behind him. "Get off my land," Caleb said. Huxley chuckled, pushing off the truck. "Funny thing about this county," he drawled. "Lines blur, land law loyalty. People dig in the wrong places, start finding things that don't belong to them." He took a few steps closer, hands tucked casually in his pockets, voice dropping. "You don't want to be that kind of person, Rowe. The kind who doesn't know when to stop asking questions." "I know exactly when to stop," Caleb said. "When the truth's out." Huxley's smile flickered. "You think the sheriff's going to save you? Think anyone cares what you and your broken-down rescue herd have to say once real money's on the table?" He leaned in just enough that Caleb could smell stale coffee and something sour on his breath. "You have no idea who you're up against," he whispered, "and you don't want to learn." Caleb didn't move. "Last warning," he said. "Get off my land." They stood there, silence stretched tight as a wire, until Huxley finally shrugged and stepped back. "Suit yourself," he said lightly. "Just remember, I tried to be neighborly." He climbed into his truck and drove away, taillights disappearing into the dark. Caleb watched him go, every instinct screaming that he'd just been marked. The proof came quickly. Over the next few nights, unfamiliar trucks appeared along the edges of his property line. Their engines idled low in the dark headlights, occasionally flicking on to sweep across the barn and the house the pens before snapping off again. The second night, a pair of high beams lingered on the new horse paddock so long that Ghost started pacing, and Brimstone exploded into panicked whinnies, rearing against his stalled door. "That's enough," Caleb muttered, stepping onto the porch with a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. The lights vanished. Gravel crunched. Silence followed, but it felt more like a held breath than a retreat. He started sleeping lighter. Gun propped by the door. Boots beside the bed. Phone fully charged. It still wasn't enough. On the third night, the explosion sounded like someone slamming an iron gate. Caleb jerked awake to a dull whump and an instant chorus of terrified, screaming, high, desperate equine shrieks that sliced straight through his chest. He was out of bed and on the porch in seconds. Flames roared from the far side of the main barn, orange tongues climbing fast into the sky. Smoke rolled thick and oily, laced with the unnatural brightness of accelerant. No, Caleb sprinted toward the barn, the heat hitting him like a wall even from a distance. As he grabbed for the first stall door, he realized with horror that the latch had been wired shut from the outside. Someone had locked them in. Horses inside slammed against the doors, eyes wild and rolling in the firelight. The crackle of burning wood and the pop of collapsing beams mixed with the sounds of animals losing their minds. Caleb grabbed a crowbar and began prying frantically at the first padlocked latch. It gave with a shriek of metal. A bay mare shot past him, nearly knocking him over as she bolted into the night. Smoke clawed at his lungs. His eyes streamed. Every breath felt like swallowing knives. He moved to the next door, but the fire leapt forward, greedy and fast, cutting off the aisle. Heat hammered his skin. Sparks rained searing tiny burns into his arms. He had to back away or die with them. "I'm sorry," he coughed, stumbling, hating himself. That was when Ghost screamed. The stallion burst through a side door, engulfed in flame, his gray coat turned hellish gold under the firelight. He didn't hesitate. He plunged back into the smoke, disappearing into the inferno. "Ghost!" Caleb shouted. For a heartbeat there was nothing. Just fire and noise and the stench of burning wood. Then a side wall exploded outward from the inside. Ghost smashed through it, shoulder-first boards shattering around him. Behind him, 3 young horses burst out, clinging to his tail, as if it were a lifeline. He herded them, biting haunches, shoving shoulders, driving them toward open ground. Caleb staggered back to the front, driven by Ghost's example. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and dove into the smoke again, shoving doors with everything he had, grabbing halters, screaming hoarse commands that cut through the panic just enough to get a handful more bodies moving. Ghost wheeled and re-entered the barn a second time. Fire licking at his mane, eyes wild but focused. Caleb watched in stunned horror as the stallion vanished into the glowing orange haze and, moments later, emerged again, this time with an older gelding pressed so close to his side they might as well have been one animal. By the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, there was nothing left to save of the structure. The main wing collapsed in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the sky like fireflies from hell. But the horses, they were alive. Shaking, coughing eyes wide and rimmed with soot, but alive. Ghost stood at the center of the cluster sides, heaving singed hair curling along his neck. He bared his teeth at every human who came too close, until he was sure they were only there to help. Caleb sank to his knees beside him, burying his face against the stallion's smoky shoulder. "You did it," he rasped. "You crazy, beautiful idiot. You saved them." Ghost blew a tired breath through his nostrils and rested his head briefly on Caleb's back. The next morning, May pulled footage from the ranch's security cameras. One angle caught everything: the first tongue of flame licking along the eaves, the shadow of a figure fleeing toward a waiting truck, the sudden explosion of Ghost, smashing through the side of the barn and leading the trapped horses out. June uploaded the clip to a private rescue network, thinking other advocates needed to see what they were up against. Within hours, it broke containment. By noon, hundreds of thousands of people had watched the gray stallion run into fire over and over again. Comments flooded in. Artists started sketching him. Someone tagged the video "The Fire Horse of Rowe Ranch." By evening, news stations were calling Caleb's phone. By the next morning, "Shut Down Redwater" was trending statewide. Sheriff Celia Grant didn't waste the moment. Armed with the Kenya notebook, the burned footage, and the pressure of half the internet watching, she stood before a judge and laid out her request for a warrant. By dawn, she and a team of deputies were standing at the gates of Redwater Auction. Huxley looked smaller in daylight, less like a predator and more like a cornered rat. "This is harassment," he snapped as they presented the warrant. "You've got no right." Celia held up the notebook and the printed manifests. "We have plenty of right," she said coldly. "Step aside." The deputies tore through the office storage sheds and back rooms. They found shoeboxes full of microchips pried from horses' necks, ledgers listing coded lot numbers, transport schedules with original destinations scratched out and replaced with border waypoints, and invoices showing regular payments from one of Silas Bruckner's shell companies. Every page they turned matched Jonah's notebook. By mid-afternoon, word came down from the state investigators when they'd tried to contact Silas Bruckner for questioning. They discovered he'd left the state the night before, shuttering his main warehouse and disappearing with his top men. The story hit the evening news. Rodeo magnate and transport tycoon Silas Bruckner wanted in connection with multi-state horse trafficking ring, the anchors said. Caleb stood in the pasture with Ghost at his shoulder, watching the report on his phone. Wind ruffled the stallion's singed mane. The herd grazed quietly nearby, unaware of the storm swirling around their survival. "It's not over," Caleb murmured, thumb tightening on the phone. Ghost flicked an ear toward him, then toward the horizon, as if to say, "Then we keep going." They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Sheriff Grant called just after sunrise, voice clipped with urgency. "We got a break," she said. A driver flipped. Said he saw one of Bruckner's convoys leaving a southern warehouse before dawn. 40 horses, no manifests, heading straight for the border. Caleb's chest went cold. He's going to kill them. "He's going to erase them," Celia said. "And with them, the rest of our evidence. We're tracking one of the old GPS units. He forgot to disable trucks on the mountain road to Las Brasas. There's only one pass they can take. We cut them off there. We've got him." "I'm coming," Caleb said automatically. "I figured you'd say that," she replied. "June's already on her way. Bring Ghost. He's the only leverage those horses will understand." Caleb didn't argue. Within 20 minutes, he and June were in his truck. Ghost loading himself into the small trailer with the grim focus of a soldier heading back into battle. The sky was still dim when they hit the highway. Sheriff Grant's cruiser a flashing guide ahead of them. Dust streamed behind all 3 vehicles as they tore through the desert, radio chatter crackling. They're 45 minutes from the border, Celia's voice came through. "Road narrows in 10 miles. 1 lane each way. Sheer drop on one side, rock wall on the other. Perfect place to stop them if we're fast enough." June watched the GPS on her phone. "They can't turn a rig like that around on the pass," she said. "Once they're in, they're committed." "Good," Caleb said. "Let's make them commit." The road grew steeper and more twisted the closer they got to the mountains. Wind howled between peaks, pushing at the truck's frame. Caleb kept his hands at 10 and 2 knuckles white trailer hitch rattling behind them from every turn. "Lights ahead," June said, suddenly pointing. Far up the dark ribbon of road, a pair of red tail lights flickered, then 2 more, then a 3rd set beyond that. A convoy, at least 3 trucks. "Got 'em," Celia said over the radio. "No shoulder up ahead. We catch them in the choke point." The grade steepened. Caleb's engine groaned. The trailers swayed once too sharply, and from inside, Ghost threw himself against the divider, whinnying in protest. "Hang on, boy," Caleb muttered. Almost there. He was wrong. Ghost had no intention of waiting. As they rounded a tight curve, the trailer lurched over a pothole. And with a metallic screech, the compromised latch Ghost had been worrying at since the canyon finally gave out. The back door burst open. "Caleb June!" shouted. Ghost launched himself out of the moving trailer. For one horrible second, all Caleb saw in the side mirror was a gray blur and flying hooves. Then Ghost landed hard, skidded, and somehow found his legs gathering himself into a flat-out gallop up the center of the road. Caleb stomped the brakes. The truck fishtailed tires shrieking, but he managed to avoid spinning out. "Ghost!" he yelled, leaning out the window. "Get back here!" The stallion did not even flick an ear. He flew past Sheriff Grant's cruiser main, whipping eyes locked on the trucks ahead. "They're hitting the pass," June said, voice strained. "He's going to get there first." On the narrowest section of road, where the blacktop hugged the cliff so closely there was barely room for two vehicles, Ghost swerved in front of the lead truck and stopped dead legs, braced, head lowered like a bull about to charge. The driver laid on the horn. Brakes screamed. The entire convoy shuddered rear trailers, swaying dangerously close to the edge before jolting to a stop. Behind them, the canyon yawned, empty and waiting. The noise inside the cattle trailers shifted. A moment ago, the horses had been silent in that terrible way of animals who had given up. Now they erupted. Hooves slammed against metal. Screams ricocheted through the boxes. They'd heard something, smelled someone they knew. Ghost. He stood in the center of the lane, tail lashing as those unseen horses hammered at their prisons, calling to him. On the side of the lead truck, a door slammed. Silas Bruckner stepped out. He looked older than in his promotional photos, a little heavier hair, thinner, but his eyes held the same oily confidence. That slipped the moment he saw Ghost blocking his way. "You have got to be kidding me," he snarled. Then he saw Caleb's truck sliding to a stop, June already scrambling out, and Sheriff Grant's cruiser behind them, lights off, sirens silent, but presence loud. Bruckner's hand went to his waistband. The pistol came out smooth and easy, like it had been there his entire life. "Not another step," he barked, pointing the gun at Caleb as he approached. Caleb froze, hands open at his sides. "Step away from the truck, Bruckner," he said. "This is over." Bruckner laughed, once short and sharp. "You think this is over. You think you've won because you stole a few glue horses and cried about it on the internet." He gestured with the gun toward Ghost. "Move that animal, or I'll put him down." Caleb shifted sideways, putting himself between Bruckner and the stallion. "You already tried that once," he said quietly. "Didn't work." Recognition flickered in Bruckner's eyes. "So the sheriff showed you your little notebook," he sneered. "Jonah's last love letter." "Jonah was my friend," Caleb said. "You murdered him." Bruckner's lip curled. "He talked too much. Like you." He took a step forward, gun steady, back away from the horse row. "He's not worth dying for." Caleb didn't move. He thought he was worth it, he said. Jonah. Those were his last seconds, choosing to save this horse instead of himself. Bruckner's jaw clenched. Jonah said almost exactly the same thing, he said, voice cold. "I've seen enough of what you do." Then he hit the ground. The words hit Caleb like a fist. There it was, the confession he'd always known existed, spoken without even realizing the weight of it. Bruckner lifted the gun higher. Caleb swallowed, then slowly began to step back, not away from Ghost, but toward the outer edge of the road. "Fine," he said. "You want to talk? Let's talk where you did it." Bruckner frowned, thrown by the shift, but advanced automatically to keep his aim. The wind whipped colder here. The asphalt crumbled near the edge. Down below, the same emptiness waited, the same abyss that had swallowed Jonah Pike a year ago. "This is the spot, isn't it?" Caleb said. You had his truck parked right about there. Shot at his horse. He went down. You shoved him over and told the world it was a fall. Bruckner's eyes flicked to the edge just for a second. Old memory. Old guilt. Old fear. It was enough. Now Sheriff Grant's voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Bruckner spun toward the sound. Behind him, June sprinted for the rear trailer doors, knife flashing as she slashed through the binding straps that kept the metal ramps locked in place. One door dropped with a crash. A panicked mare burst out, nearly bowling her over. Grant advanced with her gun drawn. Silas Bruckner dropped the weapon. He swore and whipped back toward Caleb, too many threats coming from too many directions. The pistol wavered. Ghost screamed. The freed horse cries rose in a wave. The herd inside the remaining trailer detonated into motion, slamming their weight against the doors. The truck rocked dangerously. In the chaos, Caleb did the only thing he knew how to do. He moved. He lunged at Bruckner, catching him square in the ribs. They hit the asphalt, hard momentum, carrying them both toward the edge. Gravel skittered out from beneath them and vanished into the void. Bruckner clawed at the ground boots, scraping for purchase. His fingers brushed the gun, pushing it further away. Caleb grabbed his wrist, pinning it down, muscles burning. "You're done," he growled. "You hear me? You don't get to hurt anyone else. Not one more horse, not one more man." Bruckner spat, trying to twist free. He didn't get the chance. Sheriff Celia Grant closed the distance in 4 long strides, holstered her pistol, and grabbed Bruckner's free arm, wrenching it behind his back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. Silas howled. Celia slapped cuffs on his wrists and hauled him to his feet. "Silas Bruckner," she announced, voice echoing off rock and sky, "you are under arrest for the murder of Jonah Pike, illegal livestock, trafficking across state and national lines, and arson, with intent to destroy evidence." Bruckner's face drained of color. He looked toward the trailers, where June had now opened the second door. Horses poured out in a chaotic stream, thin, wild-eyed, but free. Ghost stood on the wide shoulder of the road, calling to them with a deep, commanding whinny. They flocked to him. He stepped back slowly, guiding them away from the drop, always between the newly freed animals, and the cliff shoving them when they veered too close, blocking with his own body when panic overtook them. One young mare's hoof slipped on loose gravel. She skidded toward the edge, eyes rolling white. Ghost wheeled and slammed his shoulder into hers, driving her back onto solid ground. She stumbled, then righted herself, pressing in close to his side like a foal to its dam. June watched with wide eyes. He's organizing them," she whispered. "He's actually leading them." Caleb pulled in a shaky breath chest, burning adrenaline beginning to ebb. He wiped blood and dust from his cheek and looked past Bruckner, past the trucks, to the canyon beyond. For the first time since Jonah died, the sight didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a promise kept. Ghost lifted his head, eyes finding Caleb's across the chaos. "We did it," that look said. "We brought them home." Caleb nodded once, throat tight. "Yeah," he whispered. "We did." The dust of the long legal battle had barely begun to settle when Caleb Rowe finally opened the small, weather-worn notebook Jonah Pike had died to protect. He sat alone at his kitchen table, Ghost grazing quietly outside the window, and traced the edges of the final page with trembling fingers. The handwriting there was rushed, shaky, written by a man who must have known he was running out of time. "If I don't make it back, take Ghost to my mom. He'll know the way." Caleb bowed his head, letting the weight of the words sink deep into his bones. Jonah hadn't been asking a favor. He had been writing a farewell. A final act of entrusting the creature he loved most to the only person he believed could understand him. "I'll take him home," Caleb whispered. "I swear it." The next morning he brushed Ghost's coat until it shone like scattered moonlight, saddled him with gentle hands, and led him out through the ranch gate. The sun was still low, glinting off the red dirt road that wound toward the old Pike property. Ghost walked calmly at first, but as they neared a grove of eucalyptus trees lining a narrow driveway, the stallion's ears flicked forward. His steps slowed. His head lifted. He breathed in long and deep nostrils flaring. Caleb felt it too, the quiet familiarity of a place that had once held laughter, the distant warmth of another life. When he unlatched the gate, Ghost didn't wait for direction. He stepped through on his own hooves, sinking into the familiar dust. His tail lifted slightly. He knew this road, knew this home. Jonah had been right, Ghost remembered. The old wooden house sat tucked beneath the shade of tall trees, their leaves whispering in the soft wind. The front steps were worn, the paint on the railing chipped, but the place radiated a gentle, enduring strength, the kind of home that had seen seasons of both joy and sorrow, and survived them all. Ghost let out a sudden piercing whinny. The sound cracked the stillness wide open. A moment later, the screen door slammed against its frame. Martha Pike appeared on the porch, a small, frail woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple knot. Her eyes blinked against the light and then widened in shock. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Ghost," she stumbled down the steps, hands, trembling heart visibly racing beneath her sweater. Ghost surged forward, hooves thudding softly against the ground before skidding to a gentle halt right in front of her. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead to her knees in a reverent bow. Martha let out a sob that carried a year's worth of grief. She dropped to her knees, arms wrapping tightly around the stallion's neck. "You're alive," she choked out. "My sweet boy, you're still alive. And you stayed with him at the end, didn't you? You protected my Jonah until your last breath." Ghost breathed out a low, rumbling exhale, brushing his nose against her cheek as if to say yes. Caleb stepped quietly aside, giving them space. Martha's quiet sobbing twisted something deep inside him, grief, relief, and something that felt like healing beginning to stitch its way back into the world. When Martha finally stood wiping her eyes, she waved Caleb toward the porch. "Come inside," she said. "Tell me everything." They sat together on the wooden steps, Ghost standing nearby, with his head lowered respectfully. The late morning sun filtered through the eucalyptus branches, scattering soft patterns on the porch. Caleb spoke gently, choosing each word with care. He told her about the trafficking ring Jonah had uncovered, the putrid deals, the corrupted paperwork. The night Jonah rode into Dark Canyon, thinking he was doing one last patrol before meeting Caleb for supper. He told her about the ambush, the shot fired, Ghost wounded, Jonah fighting back until the final blow. He told her about the notebook buried under layers of dirt Jonah's plea for justice left for Caleb to find. And he told her about Ghost, how he had run for help, how he had survived, how he had carried the memory of Jonah all the way to the canyon again, guiding Caleb to the truth even when no one else could. By the time Caleb finished, Martha's cheeks were wet again. She reached across and took his calloused hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me my son back. Not in body, but in truth. Without Ghost, without you, I would never have known how brave he was, how hard he fought." Caleb swallowed past the tightness in his chest. "He loved you," he said softly. "He talked about you every chance he had." Martha smiled through her tears, then rose quietly. "Wait here," she said. She disappeared into the house and returned moments later holding a worn leather saddle. The edges were frayed, the stitching weathered, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Jonah's first saddle. He always said this belonged with someone who understood horses the way he did. Martha said, placing it gently into Caleb's hands. He trusted you. And now, so do I. Carry it with you. Finish what the two of you started. Caleb bowed his head. I'll honor him, he whispered. Every day. Ghost brushed against his shoulder, as if sealing the promise. Back at the ranch, Caleb hung Jonah's saddle on the main barn wall, cleaned, polished, and displayed where every volunteer and visitor could see it. The leather caught the afternoon light, a quiet monument to a life lived fiercely and lost too soon. Standing beneath it, Caleb made his announcement. From this day forward, he said to May June and the dozen volunteers gathered near the paddocks, this place will be called the Jonah Pike Sanctuary, a home for every horse who has nowhere left to go. June smiled softly, eyes glinting. May wiped tears she pretended weren't there. The volunteers clapped, murmuring the name like a blessing. Word spread faster than Caleb expected. Donations began showing up, feed shipments, bales of hay, ropes, blankets, medical supplies. Ranchers came to help mend fences. Old rodeo friends sent money and offered to volunteer weekends. Veterans who had once ridden with Jonah stopped by to share stories and offer support. And horses thin, limping, starved, scared, found their way to Caleb's gates with increasing frequency. The sanctuary grew. So did Ghost's role. May oversaw the medical program, nursing each horse back to strength with patience and firm, loving hands. By early autumn, animals who had once trembled at the sight of a human were trotting confidently across the sprawling pastures. Their coats glistened, their eyes brightened, their spirits returned. Ghost became the herd's natural leader. He guided the anxious newcomers, intervened during fights, and circled the fences every morning like a sentinel, ensuring everyone was safe. Horses followed him the way rivers followed gravity. Sometimes when Caleb watched from afar, he wondered if Jonah could see it all, if somewhere beyond the veil he was smiling at the horse who refused to let his legacy die. June moved into a small cabin on the property, rolling her few belongings into the bunkhouse, with an ease that made Caleb wonder if she'd been heading here her entire life. She helped structure the sanctuary's operations and proposed something no one had expected, a therapy program for veterans struggling with trauma. Jonah believed in healing people through horses, she said. Let's finish that dream for him. Caleb agreed instantly. The first group came a month later. 4 men and a woman, each carrying burdens no one could see. Ghost approached them first, lowering his head, breathing softly, as if asking permission to share their pain. Some of them cried on sight. One whispered, I rode with Jonah once, then broke down completely. Ghost stood with him until the sobs quieted. The sanctuary wasn't just saving horses anymore. It was saving people too. With the sanctuary growing, space quickly became an issue. June suggested starting a community fundraiser to build an additional barn. They expected a handful of donations. Instead, the campaign exploded. Within 2 weeks, they had more than enough money to build a new structure. When it came time to name the barn, the community insisted unanimously, the Ghost Barn. For the horse that saved them all, one donor wrote in the comment box. Ghost didn't seem to understand the honor, but he accepted the extra apples and brushing sessions as if he'd been expecting them all along. One evening, months after the arrest and trial and the long stretch of rebuilding, Caleb found himself standing on the porch of the ranch house as the sun settled into a warm, amber haze over the sanctuary. The pasture stretched before him like a golden sea, dozens of horses galloping freely through the tall grass mains, catching the wind hooves, pushing up small clouds of dust. The banner reading Jonah Pike Sanctuary fluttered gently in the breeze. Ghost stepped up beside him, his shadow merging with Caleb's on the wooden planks. He nudged Caleb's arm, then simply stood there, their shoulders touching, partners, equal survivors. Caleb smiled quietly. "Be the man your horse believes you are," he said under his breath, quoting Jonah's favorite saying. Ghost lifted his head, let out a low, rumbling whinny that vibrated in Caleb's chest, and looked at him with eyes that seemed older and wiser than any human's. "You did it," that look said. "You kept your promise. He can rest now. We can all rest now." Caleb exhaled slowly, letting the last of the grief and fear leave his body for the first time in years. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sanctuary in colors of fire and forgiveness, Caleb rested a hand on Ghost's neck. "Let's go home," he whispered. And together, they turned toward the pasture, toward a future Jonah had died to protect, a future Ghost had fought to save, and a home finally worthy of the name Sanctuary. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this story. Your time, kindness, and curiosity mean the world to us. If you'd like more emotional, powerful tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring the next story to life.